everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Esfandiar Batmangelic. I am the CEO of the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation, and we're delighted to welcome you for this webinar that's going to explore the connection between Central Asia's policy response to the economic headwinds caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia, and the role of media narratives. Now, I'm particularly excited about this webinar because both, I think it's an incredibly important topic for us to discuss, a highly timely webinar, and also because it represents a new kind of event or a new sort of attempt for the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation to engage on issues in Central Asia. Over the last year, the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation has been trying to increase the research on economic diplomacy and economic development that it is doing on Central Asia. And this webinar is an excellent example of that effort. So a couple housekeeping points before we continue, but for those of you who are joining us and eager to ask the panelists your questions, you'll be able to do so by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will start with around 45 minutes of moderated discussion before we move into a Q&A session with questions from the audience. And so please do, as we go through the conversation, add your questions in the Q&A section, and we will take them later in the session. But before we begin, I wanted to turn the floor to our visiting fellow, Hasan Rajaboev, who is from Uzbekistan and is studying political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it was Hasan's brilliant idea to put this webinar together. And I wanted to give him the opportunity to explain for all of us why he felt this webinar was important and why he wanted to connect the policy response of Central Asian governments to this new crisis to the issue of media narratives. So Hasan, turning the floor to you, tell us a little bit more about why you thought this discussion would be timely.
Thank you very much, Esfandiar. I'd like to welcome everyone who's participating and attending this webinar. Really excited about this. And I would like to thank especially our speakers for setting aside their precious times to share their expertise with us. As Russia's war on Ukraine rages on, obviously people started paying more attention to the politics of Russia, to the economic statecraft of Russia, as well as the influence that Russia builds on. And this goes beyond soft power, or one of the terms that we tend to use when thinking about the influence that goes beyond the hard diplomatic or otherwise measures. And when it comes to Russian state propaganda or Russian state-funded media influences, it's much more influential, as we find out, than previously assumed. And most of it also goes to the legacy of Soviet Union and the Russia's long presence in vast areas of Eurasia. So when putting together this event, I really had in mind on how to conceptualize the influence of Russian media narratives in a way that goes beyond the war on Ukraine, but also touched on Russia's important arm of coercive economic diplomacy when it comes to imposing its economic interests in its neighborhood, in the areas where it feels it has exclusive rights over certain trade, economic, and investment deals. And as we with Esfandiar co-authored a short policy paper for East Asia Foundation, which was also cross-posted on Bourse and Bazaar Foundation, which I encourage everyone to read, we argued that this influence goes much beyond labor migrant market and really touched upon economic decision-making, policy-making, as well as the public perception of Russia as a great power, as well as a great economic power. So we also need to understand that Russian state-owned enterprises are extraordinarily active in Central Asian region. There's Roshydro in Tajikistan. Rosatom secured an immense nuclear power station project in Uzbekistan, and really the list goes on. And Eurasian Economic Union, that many would argue is a political union and political influence-making organization rather than just the economic free trade zone, is often posted by Russian media as something like a zero-sum alternative to a World Trade Organization or some other more beneficial at times trade unions or trade treaties. And obviously there's energy dependence. So understanding better and charting the path for every one of us on how to evaluate external media narratives used as part of economic stagecraft and influence building would be an important outcome of this webinar, as I hope. So thank you very much again for joining. I would like to now pass the back to Esfandiar, and hopefully we'll have a very fruitful discussion as we address this bear in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasan. So addressing the bear in the room, the perfect person to start with is Anton. Anton is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He studies Russian propaganda and misinformation efforts, and he previously worked as a journalist and editor in Russian independent media. And Anton, I wanted to come to you first to try and help us contextualize the challenge of propaganda and misinformation, as we go through this really this crisis period with Russia. I'm sure you've been following things very closely in recent weeks, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about really what are you seeing in terms of the Russian use of state propaganda, and how is that being filtered through Russian news media? And in terms of your research, can you tell us a little bit about who are the targets of these narratives as they're being kind of sent out by state media in Russia, and what makes people susceptible to maybe believing some of the narratives that are being put forward?
Great. Thank you, Esfandiar and Hasan, for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here and for a chance, to provide some background on Russian media. So as you probably know, most of Russian media are controlled by the state directly or indirectly. And there are, especially after recent shutdowns of key independent news outlets and essentially military censorship. Right now, there are still a few relatively neutral outlets that try to report on war, report on problems in the Russian society, but they are very much constrained in what they can say. And in many ways, they just retranslate the official position of the Russian state. Most of propaganda, though, is transmitted through television and through state-controlled media, such as RT or RIA Novosti, and through some online media or online news aggregators like Yandex News. And the main goals of their messaging, I would say there are three main goals to what they're trying to say. First, it is, of course, to get the Russian vision of the war and Russian vision of politics, world politics in general, across. That means shifting the blame for what's going on Ukraine and NATO, talking about Russian army as a liberation army, if we're talking about the war in Ukraine. It is about smearing any Western initiatives. It is about it is about demonstrating that the West is weak and Russia is trying to bring about a more just and more equal international order, things like that. The other goal is, of course, that the propaganda understands that not everyone will be able to believe that, especially outside of Russia. And so the second goal is to undermine independent journalism, to discredit alternative information sources. The logic of propaganda in this sense is as follows. While we might be lying, but everyone else is lying too, so you shouldn't really believe anyone. The goal is to sow doubt and distrust toward any information you can encounter. So basically to level the playing field for the propaganda. And then the third goal is to project this image of very powerful, strong Russia, create an impression of an overwhelming support for President Putin and for his actions and for the war in particular. As for these three goals, all of these three goals are in effect with respect to both domestic and international audiences. But at the same time, I would say that with respect to international audiences, the second goal and the third goal, that is to sow confusion and doubt and to project a Russian strength, are the most important, because obviously propaganda and the Kremlin understand that people outside of Russia inevitably have access to some other source of information. Now, as to who are the targets of this propaganda and who's susceptible to it, I would say there are generally two groups of people, one of which is people who are already pro-Putin, anti-Western, anti-liberal. And with respect to those people, the goal of propaganda is engage with them more, to keep them engaged, to send them more of the messages that they already believe about Western failures, about Russia's successes, about about pride in Russia. Many of these people are Russian speakers, especially in the near abroad and in the far abroad as well, in the UK, in Europe, in the United States. And the goal here is, just to keep them engaged. They are susceptible to propaganda mainly because they already believe most of what it's saying. The other group is people who are more apolitical, who are less, I would say, engaged in politics, who have less knowledge of various information sources. And these people are exposed to propaganda just because they don't have interest or capacity to look for alternatives online. And as a result, they are just they're exposed to these narratives and they don't see much of an alternative. I would say that from my research, it seems that these two groups of people are not, fundamentally stupid or fundamentally more susceptible to misinformation or propaganda. If we talk about, their capacity to recognize false messages, it is not much worse than among other people who are more opposition-minded or critically minded. The main problem is that these people are just either biased towards propaganda, politically biased, or they just don't have access or lack interest and access in the alternative worldview. And so in principle, the other group is I guess salvageable, whereas as for the first group, it's unclear what we can do about it. Okay, I'll stop here and pass on to other participants.
Thank you, Anton. I think the two goals that you set out for propaganda, undermining the independent journalism to create confusion and projecting an image of strong Russia, obviously have a strong kind of bearing on how propaganda is being mobilized in Central Asia. I also think it sounds like both of the two susceptible groups you described probably exist in Central Asia. There are people that are inherently maybe pro-Putin, but probably a larger group of people who might lack access to independent sources of media. And so I want to turn now to Hannah. Hannah Chapman is an assistant professor of political science at Miami University in Ohio. And Hannah, you've also worked on Russian propaganda, but I think very relevantly for this conversation, you've also looked at Russian media in a Central Asian context. So could you maybe react a little bit to Anton's opening comments and the goals he set out? And drawing on your research, how do you think that Russian actors right now might be seeking to influence perceptions about the conflict and its fallout among the public in Central Asia? And do you see any changes in terms of how Russian media has operated historically and how it might start operating today in a Central Asian context, particularly with a view to how media might be shaping the opinions of business and political leaders who are going to have to make some big decisions about what they do in response to the new conditions on the ground?
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. And I really appreciate this invitation. I think that what I have to say really complements what Anton just opened in his initial remarks, which is that, Russia has a very extensive foreign media apparatus around the world, but particularly in Central Asia, which it considers a part of its near abroad. And so its goals, as well as the impact on public opinion, really do reflect its broader goals for its general foreign media. So in my research, which is primarily looks at Russian media in Kyrgyzstan, but also in Kazakhstan, we've seen kind of two of these main goals that Anton kind of really already discussed. The first is really to promote a positive image of Russia and its leadership, and specifically with the goal of situating Russia as both a political and economic leader and ally in Central Asia, and as a force for stability in the region. They also try to promote Russia's perspective on a variety of issues from, current events to Russia's domestic political institutions, as well as its foreign policy, specifically with the goal of what they say is combating Western hegemony and Western liberal ideas in media in the region. And what I found in my research is that people in Kyrgyzstan frequently turn to Russian media for information, both about international events, but as well as domestic events that go on within the countries as well. So participants in focus groups were frequently stated that in large part due to insufficient funding and lack of Kyrgyzstani foreign correspondents, that they frequently turn specifically to Russian news and Russian media for information about international events. So in particular, the respondents noted that they look for information from Russian news, specifically about international events, because they are so well covered and so well produced. But I also found that people in Central Asia, specifically again, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, don't only turn to Russian media for international news, but also for information about domestic events. A very popular one that came up in these focus groups were the 2010 conflict in Osh, for example. And so what we find is that Russian media in Central Asia has a key advantage in that, unlike a lot of the independent media within these countries, they are very well resourced, which means that they're able to cover a wide variety of topics and do so in quite a visually appealing and interesting manner that many people find engaging. However, as Anton noted, viewership doesn't necessarily equal engagement. And it does appear that although Russian media continues to play a very central role in the media sphere in these countries, it does seem to be slightly on the decline in recent years, as propaganda efforts have perhaps become less convincing the harder that they try to push them in these countries. So as people gain access to more information, specifically information on the internet, for example, we have found that recent surveys from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan show that viewership of Russian media in Central Asia has been on the decline. Similarly, we see in polls around all of the countries in Central Asia that more and more people are beginning to distrust Russian media outlets as the propaganda departs a lot with the reality. So who is actually influenced by the Russian media and these narratives? So as Anton noted, a lot of my research does indicate that the people that are most likely to buy into these messages are those that are either pro-Russian or have close Russian family ties, such as family members that work in the country, and also those that are less politically engaged. But beyond these specific individuals and individual characteristics, we also have to look at the type of issue that is being covered, which I think is really relevant to the current situation in Ukraine. So I find that, the strongest impact of foreign media is specifically for issues that are either not widely covered in other media, so that are not covered by independent outlets within the country, or those that are far from the lived experiences of audience, those that don't resonate with people on their personal basis. Something that we may need to consider as, for example, Margarita Semyonin, the RT boss's husband, who recently came out and made some thinly veiled threats about Kazakhstan's independence. So the takeaway here is that the effectiveness of Russian media as a tool for persuasion in Central Asia is very much limited to specific types of issues. So issues such as the war in Ukraine are less likely to shape people's ideas. Russian media is less likely to shape people's ideas in this way because people are more likely to find out about this topic from other sources, whether other media or just through their daily lives. So it also similarly implies that people for whom the war resonates personally, again, maybe people who have been personally threatened by Russia's invasion of the country, are less likely to buy into the narrative, thus reducing its overall effectiveness. And so I'll stop there.
So Hannah, thank you for that. I mean, before I turn to Timur, who's going to talk a little bit more about the economic dimension, I wanted to just ask a quick follow-up. So I think it makes sense, definitely, that something like the the Russian how Russia is faring in the war on Ukraine and the nature of the Russian kind of engagement there. As Anton said, one of the goals of Russian propaganda is to make Russia look like, it's a just actor in that conflict. Mm-hmm. That seems like something that can be pretty easily pushed back against, and that there's going to be a lot of reporting and coverage from a wide range of media sources. But what about when it comes to things that are a little bit more narrowly focused, like the economic fallout mm-hmm. from the conflict? Do you believe that that's because it's something that is a little bit more difficult for people to understand, at least beyond issues like the remittance flows that we'll probably hear about from Timur? Is that an area where you think that there might be a little bit more effectiveness from Russian sort of media to shape people's perceptions?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is both yes and no. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So I think that in some ways, Russia's narrative could be more effective for economic issues if they are not issues that people have a close tie to. That is something my research has found over and over. So if it's something that either they're really not aware of or that doesn't touch their lives. So in the sense that economic fallout from the war could be far removed and distant from individuals, then it is more likely that the Russian narrative could be more effective. However, I do think there are certain aspects of a potential economic fallout, such as the lack of remittances, such as increased difficulties of just, people's everyday lives, what they're able to afford, the economic situation around them, that it's going to be really difficult for Russian media to cover up, right? If people are opening up their fridges and finding less goods in there, they're not going to really believe if Russian media says that everything is fine, nothing is going on. So it really depends on what part of the economic aspect we're looking at and how closely people in their personal lives feel this.
Thanks, Hannah. That makes a lot of sense. Timur, now turning to you, and thank you for joining us all the way from Samarkand. And we hope that we're not imposing on any Eid celebrations. But what I wanted to turn to you for is for you to give us a little bit of context on the economic dimension here. So we started off by talking about the goals of Russian propaganda and how Russian propaganda and news media operate within Central Asia. But one of the unique aspects of this conversation is Hassan's sort of suggestion that we should look at the role of media within the context of the ensuing debates about how Central Asian economies need to react to the headwinds that they're experiencing from the Russia crisis. So maybe it would be good to hear from you a little bit about what exactly are the challenges that Central Asian governments are going to be facing from an economic perspective, and how do you feel that Russia might want to weigh in on the debates that are certainly happening in Central Asian capitals about the policy response? Should Central Asia should it double down and become more closely tied to Russia in this environment? Does it have to? Or should Central Asian governments be pushing for new economic models?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me, Anton. But if I am, please do let me know. Unfortunately, the connection is not stable here. They're gonna be a lot of differences in Central Asia, witnessing more than 2 months of the war of Russia on Ukraine, and everyone is talking about changing. So talking about the immediate consequences of the crisis is, of course, the logistics of Central Asian countries. As we all know, these countries are landlocked, and the connections with the world that Central Asia has was built mainly during the times of Soviet Union, and logically it was built through Russia, as Soviet Union was this centralized country, and because of that, all of the Central Asian countries depend logistically on their imports of anything, not only from Russia, but also from other parts of the world via Russian territory. And when you have Russia under sanctions and big logistic companies stopping their operations on Russian territory, you just cannot, order what you have been ordering from, for example, European countries through Russia. This is the first problem that Central Asian countries faced with. Another problem will be seen not right now, but in the I would say short term. It is the disruption of imports of equipment that Central Asian countries usually imported from Russia. If you take a look at the trade statistics, you would see that Central Asia imports a lot of machinery from Russia, and considering that this machinery was produced not only using exclusively Russian materials, you would understand that Central Asia right now will be also facing the disruption of these imports. Also, we don't know what's going to happen to all of the mutual projects that Russia had or planned to have with Central Asian countries. Just last year, sanctioned Gazprom Bank, VTB, had promised or signed MOUs with Uzbekistan to invest heavily. VTB even promised to invest $1 billion to Navoi metallurgic plant. So now all of this is under question, and I don't think that it will be possible for Uzbekistan to continue to working with these institutions, as it will bring to which none of the Central Asian countries want to fall into. And actually Kazakhstan has said it out loud that it doesn't want to be a country that will be used by Russia to escape from the sanctions. And last but maybe most importantly is of course the question of migrants. We know that Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan have all more than 15% of their employable population living and working in Russia as labor migrants. This is huge numbers. For Uzbekistan, is more than 3 million people. For Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, almost 1 million people both. And imagine even quarter of them coming back from Russia to their hometowns. This will be a huge problem, not only in economic terms for Central Asian countries, because you have to find jobs for them, but also from the political point of view, because labor migrants are mostly young male who, when they do not have place to work, tend to create social instability in the country. And for authoritarian regimes, this is one of the most the stability of the regime's factors. So we see that it's not only economic problems that are coming to Central Asia, but also political ones. Moving to how Russia wants to change the thinking here in Central Asia, we see the drastic contrast between Russian media focused on Central Asia right now with the problem, for example, with Afghanistan. When the Taliban came to power in Kabul, Russia wanted Central Asia to be the biggest crisis that Central Asia faced in years, that Central Asia has Russia, that the situation is extremely dangerous, but now Russia wants Central Asia dangerous, that everything is going to be okay, that Russia is actually becoming a winner of this situation, and you have to support the winning party here. It might have some effect, but also we should take into consideration the ties between the political regimes of between the political elites of two countries. For example, days ago, the Minister of Industry and Trade of Russia, Mansurov, came to Uzbekistan and he talked to President Shavkat Mirziyoyev, and Uzbekistan right now is talking about cooperating with Russia more, which is a very awkward position to take, to say the least. And it seems that Uzbekistan right now wants to use this as an opportunity to use the opportunities that Russian market becomes more open and more needy for some products that earlier Uzbekistan didn't have access to. But on the other hand, Russian industries are being kicked off from Europe, and now they want to find new markets for themselves. So Uzbekistan trying to squish most out of this crisis, but I'm afraid this might bring to some side effects or some negative comments from the Western countries, and it might bring to criticism of Uzbekistan supporting Russia in this situation. But here, I don't know whether Uzbekistan will, what will be the decision, whether to cut off the ties with Russia and to not follow the interests of very influential players in the leadership here in Uzbekistan, like Alisher Usmanov, or to not take into consideration his personal interests and to follow the what is better for national economy. So I think this will be the testing ground for Uzbekistan, and this will show what interests are more important for Uzbekistan: personal interests of political elites or national ones.
Thank you, Timur. So I unfortunately had to turn your camera off so that we could hear you clearly, but we could hear you, and that's what's important. I failed to introduce you at the beginning, and so for the sake of the audience, let me just introduce you by saying that Timur is a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he works particularly on the economies of Central Asia and their relationships with Russia and China. So I think, Timur, you raised two really important things that I want to come back to later in the conversation, which are this tension between kind of the policies that are going to be made by the political and business elite because they feel it's in their interest, and maybe public perception of what is, the right approach or what's in the national interest for the country. And then also this idea that on one hand, there may be opportunities in a moment like this from an economic standpoint. So the idea that Uzbekistan may be able to export more to Russia, but there are also vulnerabilities. The idea that importing from Russian industrial suppliers is going to be challenging. And so in some ways, how we evaluate those two sides, the opportunities and the challenges, effectively depends on kind of the type of media you're consuming, the type of information that you have available. So I think we should turn back to that later in the conversation, but it's important that we get a little bit of a sense of how actually local media in Central Asia is responding to the crisis. And to start in that conversation, I'd like to turn to Nozima Davletova, who is the director of the Foundation for Support and Development of National Mass Media. She's also an adjunct professor at Webster University in Tashkent. Nozima, thank you very much for joining us. So we've heard a little bit, and at the very beginning from Anton, about the idea that Russian news media is competing with local media, and that it is most effective in defining the narrative for audiences and readers when there isn't a strong independent local media. And one of the things that Hassan and I have discussed before is that we've been very impressed, and it may be, at least me personally, a little bit surprised that the very strong kind of coverage that independent media in Uzbekistan has given to different dimensions of this crisis. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how has the independent media, mass media developed in Uzbekistan in recent years, and how do you see them kind of responding to this crisis? What do journalists and editors feel is their responsibility about providing information, accurate information for the public in Uzbekistan?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, I would like also to delve into a bit of history of the Uzbek media becoming through the recent 6 years. So after the openness was declared by the President Mirziyoyev, the media was among the most dynamic spheres that was developing among all others, all other reforms that were declared by the president. We've come to the days when the bloggers and the journalists have all actually replaced the civil society in Uzbekistan, and they are raising very hot social and political issues. So they have certain advocacy, they have a certain influence, and they are actually making the agenda. Sometimes not that successfully, sometimes very successfully. So, the civil society in Uzbekistan actually lagging behind the media in these terms, and we're still having underdeveloped civil society. Meanwhile, the media sphere and social media sphere is rather dynamic. But as regards the reporting on the foreign policy and foreign economic issues, we have certain problems. The war in Russia actually revealed this problem. And we can say that we still fall into a huge influence of the Russian propaganda. And the Russian, I do agree with Anton that the Russian propaganda has a huge effect on the minds and hearts of people, both Russian-speaking and Uzbek-speaking. The Uzbek-speaking audience is much, much bigger in Uzbekistan. It's getting bigger. But at the same time, the Russian TV for many years after the independence is considered to be perceived to be as independent. This is a paradox. I think that it comes historically when in the 90s the Russian media was very open, very democratic and liberalized, and we have that history in mind, and we still consider the Russian media more interesting, more entertaining. And historically, we knew more political figures and personalities of Russia. And there is a certain generation of people which consider Vladimir Putin as their president. And if you talk to the taxi drivers and ordinary citizens, they say like "Наш президент," our president. This is a limited strata of people, but still, you know, this is very symptomatic. Another thing is that our media is very reluctant to report on foreign issues. The first thing is that they have little competency in this, speaking frankly. And they are also reluctant to, you know, touch upon certain issues because of self-censorship. Because, you know, they touch upon certain issues like they started to talk about corruption, to talk about certain agencies, ministries, about certain spheres of politics, but they are not very confident in the area of foreign policy and foreign economy, because they are still, you know, not confident in their own knowledge, and they are, you know, they are reluctant to report on issues that might be potentially dangerous to talk about. Because the issues related to foreign policy, they are historically related to the issues of high confidentiality. From February 24th, the blogging sphere has divided into parts. Paradoxically, the most famous and the most influential Russian-speaking bloggers are anti-war. They have anti-war rhetoric, and they are usually they usually make Facebook and Twitter posts that they are against war, against the crimes Russia committing in Ukraine. Meanwhile, some of the Uzbek-speaking bloggers are explicitly pro-Russian and pro-Putinist. There were lots of conflicts in media, in social media regarding this. Interestingly, that the official media, very few of them tried to report on the real situation, referring to the Western media. And making their reports and articles citing the Western media outlets. In general, they refer to the Russian media, or they are just tacit. They are silent about this situation, and they can make, you know, very, very general articles stating very, very general things, not relevant to anything serious. There was also an incident where when the Russian media tried to bully the Uzbek media, and in particular Nikita Makarenko, he's a famous blogger in Uzbekistan, Russian-speaking blogger. Robert Frantsov in Russia 24, he said that he was inciting, he was, he was inciting multicultural conflict in Uzbek society, and he was very toxic. He had a poisonous intoxication of the Uzbek media with his pacifist statements or something like that. There was a special program about him, about Nikita Makarenko, and they reported on certain bloggers that are actually inciting conflicts in Uzbek society against Russia, and they are inciting Russophobic statements. And they also claimed that Kunuz, this is another Uzbek online newspaper, was copying the articles from Meduza, which is oppositional to Russia, and that is automatically enemy to everyone, and they are copying the articles from there. Another media that has been reporting independently Uzbekistan about the situation in Ukraine is Gazeta Uz. They are, I think that their advantage is incompetency. So they are more confident in their competence and in their knowledge, in their skills, in the people they are inviting to make, interviews. And that is why they are more confident in making open and independent articles and interviews and materials. So they were also touching upon the economic consequences of the Russian war in Ukraine, and they were also blamed for being too pro-Western. So here is the discourse that who is reporting, independently, they are considered to be as pro-Western, and if they are reporting pro-Russian, then they are objective. So this is the discourse among the majority of the social media users, but still, we cannot have the whole picture in this because we cannot have surveys, we cannot have objective answers to our questions. What is the real percentage of supporters of Russia and who are not supporting war in Ukraine? So we didn't have any surveys like this, and I think that no one is going to make these kind of surveys for now, because they are afraid of inciting even more emotional reactions of social media users. So should I talk about the economic issues that are discussed in media? But in general, I think that Timur or anyone else has already mentioned that the economic discourse in Uzbek media is built in the way that we are still dependent on Russia. And again, this falls into a very simple dilemma. Either you are going to make a real reform and stick to your reforms, and you really liberalize the economy and get out of the dependence from Russia, and also try to diversify your economy in the way not to send millions of people to work in Russia, or you are getting even closer to Russia, not to get harmed by Russia and by the Russian government. And the public discourse is built in the way that we have to become friends with Russia, and the only one who we can rely on is Russian Federation, because we are dependent. So it's not about liberalizing our economy and sticking to the reforms, because actually liberalization is about reviewing the prices for gas, for electricity, and this is very, very unpopular. And I'm not sure that the government is really ready to go for a real liberalization, and also getting rid of the monopolies. The only way that we can expect the government to act is that keeping certain neutrality, to please both the Western partners and also not to anger too much the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Nazima. That was an excellent overview, I think, of how the Uzbek media system is reacting to this situation. There was a couple things I wanted to come back to, but Danyar has been very, very patient, so I want to turn to him next. And just a reminder for those in the audience, if you have questions you'd like to submit for the speakers, please do in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. So Danyar, you've heard our very brilliant panel kind of lay out the issues. You are based in Kazakhstan. I wanted to come to you and sort of look into the future a little bit, because in a way, Kazakhstan has got a head start on figuring out how this battle over media narratives and the battle over the question of economic or political dependence on Russia will play out. In January, there was nationwide protests in Kazakhstan that raised similar questions about how Russia was going to exert its influence in Kazakhstan in the future. And there was similarly Kazakh media had to respond to that moment and come up with its own assessment. So can you tell us a little bit about how you see things in Kazakhstan? How have, as a former journalist and editor yourself, how do your former colleagues, how are they looking at some of the challenges that Nozima described in the Uzbek case?
Well, thank you. Great to be here, and a couple of points. Let's start from the basic facts and figures just to remind what Kazakhstan is and how the Russian media presence is strong here in Kazakhstan. So, you know, before attending this event, I looked into some numbers, and there are 262 officially registered TV channels in Kazakhstan, and 70% of them are Russian. Even Discovery Channel and Animal Planet is registered in Russia. It's probably, you know, they adopt some Russian content, you know, and among 15 compulsory TV channels broadcasted throughout Kazakhstan, Channel 1 Eurasia is closely linked with Russian state-controlled Channel 1. Looking into these numbers and a wide variety of content, you know, provided by Russian TV channels, from science, culture, and travel to soap operas, entertainment, music concerts, and news outlets, one can argue that Russian media presence is strong because it's not only about propaganda or politics, actually. It's an ecosystem where each viewer can find an appealing content, you know, and switch between various channels and not only stick to political content or music content or any other content, such as, you know, stand-up comedians or so ever. In this perspective, I guess we need to have a broader perspective on Russian media influence and narratives to have a better understanding why they are so persuasive here in Kazakhstan. So the answer is it's really difficult to compete with Russian media presence because it's really a wide menu of things, you know. It's not only about, you know, supporting Putin or supporting annexation of Crimea. It's also about a cultural benchmark, which Russia is for us, and particularly for many music, you know, TV producers and so on. And for example, such famous figures, rap artists as Skriptonit, for example, or comedian as Nurlan Saburov, who were born and raised in Kazakhstan. They had moved in their 20s into Russia and become very famous there as superstars. So these are the intermediaries that actually link our cultures together and that glue the Russian mir, so-called Russian mir. So we feel, you know, a certain kind of affinity to this Russian influence. So this is a very complex story, actually. But what really concerns me throughout last 5 years is that the Russian media discourse and Russian media influence is largely an unchallenged discourse here in Kazakhstan. No one ever looked into how demographic change would affect. And as you know, and Nozima mentioned this quite clearly, that we have a new generation that watches YouTube, for example, and where we have quite critical voices such as Yuri Dud, you know, Yekaterina Shulman, and other important figures that are very critical about Russia's invasion. So we really need to expand. And actually, my point is that Russian TV and Russian propaganda before the Ukrainian war was competing against Russian YouTube. So this was one of the windows that actually helped us, particularly the new generation, to form some kind of alternative understanding what's really going on in Russia. But what's really interesting is that Russian cultural appeal through Russian YouTube does not necessarily translate into Russian political appeal. It's clear when you talk with many youngsters. As an editor-in-chief, I worked with millennials and many Zoomers, and actually, And what we really saw is that they're craving for the local content. They are really interested in local content that is being produced by the local younger generations. So it's really, we really have this potential to form an antidote that would be really based on historical reckoning, on forming an anti-colonial kind of discourse on language. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Donia. I think the point you raised at the end there, that there's a generational shift here, that it also maps onto a shift in the format of the media and how it's being consumed. I think that's a really critical one. And actually, I wanted to now ask Anton and Hannah to maybe chime in on this point. So we've talked a lot about the idea that Russia is obviously very strong in TV, that as a broadcaster, it has this presence in the region and it can reach certain audiences through TV that may not be using Telegram or blogs or new web publications. But Danyar has suggested that, that maybe with a younger generation that is less dependent on TV, there may be an opening for independent media to sort of, or local media, we should say, to break that kind of monopoly on the discourse. How do you feel about the role of the format of the media here? And, you know, what is it about Russian TV broadcasts that are particularly key to kind of that propaganda that we're seeing? Maybe Hannah, if you want to go first, and then Anton.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. We see this a lot very clearly in Kyrgyzstan, for example, where, so while television is still dominant for the majority of the population, so for all adults, over 80% of people get most of their information from TV. But amongst people, and, you know, the millennials and the Zoomers, these people in their 20s, this is only around 60%. So we definitely are seeing a very big generational divide in who gets their information from where. And so that means that these younger people are getting a much wider variety of sources. We've actually seen this reflected in the share of viewership that Russian television channels get in the country. So Russia's Channel 1 competes very heavily with the local broadcast KTRK, which is the major Kyrgyzstan television station. And while we have seen KTRK continue to have a very strong viewership, about 20% of nightly viewers use that channel. While this has decreased over time, they've only lost about 5% of that market share over the past decade. Whereas Channel 1 has seen a 50% decrease, going from also about 20% to 10%. I think this is in large part due to this generational shift of younger people using television much less for their information. So I think that that point is absolutely correct. And I think we'll continue to see this shift over time.
And Anton, I mean, presumably Russian media executives see that sort of decline in their audience share if they're dependent on TV. I imagine they're going to try and do something about it, or probably already are. You know, do you see any evidence that, for example, there's an effort to cultivate pro-Russian voices in the blogosphere, or to try and develop similar kind of narratives in online media?
Yes, definitely. So they clearly understand that young audiences do not watch television generally. I mean, some of them do, and they are still exposed to those narratives through their family, through their older relatives, so they are not immune to this. But they do not watch TV on purpose, and they are more interested in information from other sources. So what Russia does, what Russian, I would say not just the media, but Russian propaganda in general does, is they have tried to cultivate pro-Russian channels on YouTube, on Telegram. And this is, I think this is particularly interesting because they blocked Facebook, they blocked Twitter, they blocked some other platforms, but they did not block YouTube or Telegram right now. And this is partly because they have their own, propaganda channels, propaganda voices there, and they don't want to shut it down for Russians. I mean, I don't think there has been an attempt to actually map how many pro-Russian voices are there on YouTube versus more oppositional voices. I think it's probably on YouTube, it's probably more oppositional voices. On Telegram, it's maybe 50-50, maybe again, not very clear, but on Telegram, there's a very systematic and intense presence from pro-Russian public and pro-Russian channels. So I think they're trying to use this, and they have a decent following there. The question, of course, is whether they would be able to somehow shut those platforms down too, if the war really goes badly and they decide that information should not come through in any form, even if that means shutting down their own channels. We'll see. I think it's one of the interesting things to keep an eye on.
And Anton, I wanted to get your reaction to another thing that Nozima raised, which was the experience of Nikita Makarenko, an Uzbek blogger, and also the targeting of this Uzbek, one of the leading web publications, Kunuz. What do you make of the idea that Russian media figures are personalizing the attacks or specifically targeting publications to cast doubt in their credibility? Is that something that is only happening now because of there's a particularly high tensions in this current moment, or is this something that's part of the playbook and that local media in Central Asia just needs to be prepared that they may come under this kind of scrutiny or attack because of the stances they take?
I think this is a fairly standard pattern. It definitely intensified during the war, but in general, this sort of personal attacks on people who propagandists don't like, it's been pretty common. They don't they don't hesitate to use some very unpleasant characteristics. Some even swear words, and this is kind of a style of Russian propaganda. This attempt to maybe to speak to people in this simple common language, and that goes back to Putin himself. I think he uses those kinds of tricks too. So I think yes, unfortunately, independent journalists, opposition politicians, everywhere have to be prepared for this. I think right now, I think before it was more concentrated within Russia, targeted Russian opposition, maybe Russian opposition abroad, but obviously during the war, nothing is off the plate. So yeah, this is a risk.
Thanks, Anton. I want to go back to Nozima and Danyar now before going to Timur on a question that's more economic related. But Nozima, you raised this issue of language in a few instances in your first comments. So you mentioned the idea counterintuitively that sometimes the Uzbek language bloggers have been more pro-Russian, sometimes the Russian language bloggers have been more critical of the Russian stance. I think also what came up in your contribution was the idea that, the rise of a more independent local media in Uzbekistan has also meant more writing in the Uzbek language rather than simply relying on the Russian language TV or Russian language publications from abroad. So I wanted to understand a little bit about how you see language playing into this, and then also to hear from Danyar. One of the things that I've noticed in my trips to Uzbekistan is that often younger Uzbeks are obviously their mother language is Uzbek, but they're really prioritizing learning English rather than learning Russian, which is opening the door to a different media diet. They can read different things, engage with different content. How do you see that playing out in some of the topics that we've just discussed? And then turning to Danyar, I'd like to know whether in Kazakhstan you see similar trends or more space for English language media to have an influence. So Nozima, starting with you, please.
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. the language issue is key in understanding the audience, the media audience in Uzbekistan. As I mentioned, the Uzbek-speaking audience is much bigger. I think that it's around 70%. And the biggest media outlets are usually reporting in Uzbek, but the quality pieces are usually in Russian. This is about the official media, but we have prominent Uzbek-speaking bloggers that are, some of them are against war, and they were openly stating this, and they also had the threats, online threats against them, against their statements, and their audience was not that supportive about their position. Another issue is that I would like also to reflect on the link between the language and their sympathies towards Russia or anti or pro-Western views. The issue here is that we need to understand who are the heroes of young people. And I'm not sure if their role models and their heroes in social media are Schulman or, dudes. Very limited number of people watch dudes and Schulman and other, kind of intelligent talk shows in the internet. The majority of them prefer to watch TikTok and maybe YouTube, but short videos of Ramzan Kadyrov and also Vladimir Putin. Why Vladimir Putin is rather popular, again, I cannot say to what extent he is popular, but as I can judge from the students of Webster University and University of World Economy and Diplomacy, there are students who really speak very good English, but many of them, at least not few of them, are very positive about Putin. I can relate this to the issue of machismo, with which Putin represents himself. And I think young people, they need someone very strong, someone very patriarchal, someone very masculine. So this is what they see in media. And this is actually a very strong weapon in, attracting the attention of young people. Another thing is that Uzbekistan is getting very, very traditional, is getting very conservative, at some points very religious. And, in this regard, that's a mixture of traditionalism, of machismo, of very patriarchal values that make this kind of aggressive attitude and aggressive behavior in the world arena more, likable to people. And also these anti-Western sentiments are also very strong, because the Western values are also usually related to LGBTQ issues. And this is also, a very sensitive issue in Uzbekistan. And this is, again, also the product of the Russian propaganda, because they linked the Western values with LGBTQ, and it's usually when the discourse of the Western and traditional values come to the table, they usually bring the issue of LGBTQ and they link it directly. So this is how it works, how the propaganda works, and the traditional values are relevant to this discourse. And in this regard, of course, the Uzbek-speaking people are more positive about Russia's policy. And also the migrants play a huge role, despite the fact that they are working in very harsh conditions in Russia. Probably they are not very happy working there, but still this is the key destination to them, and they are still seeing Russia as a better place to live and making money than anywhere else. This is, again, the language gap, because they can still speak a bit of Russian, but the majority of them cannot speak English, and they also don't have this opportunity and access to a better education in English. That's.
Thank you, Nazima. I think an excellent answer to my question. Danyar, Nozima raised the idea that at the end of the day, there's a cultural dimension to anything related to media, and that there is this idea that it's maybe a patriarchal society, and that plays into how perceptions are shaped, what kinds of narratives are appealing. You mentioned the need that for local media in Kazakhstan to develop an anti-colonial discourse, which I thought was a strong goal. How do you see that goal? Is that goal tenable in an environment where, at the end of the day, a lot of society might still be more conservative minded and therefore a bit receptive to some of the cultural sort of messaging that comes from Russian media about where, how society should kind of be configured and what the roles are for people in that society?
Well, I think we have stepped into this path of, becoming a much more mono-ethnic society in Kazakhstan, which is largely Kazakh-speaking society. And when you look into numbers, you see that almost 70% of society speaks Kazakh now, and Russian language is really declining phenomenon. And when you look into the university attendances, for example, you will see that a majority of students will choose Kazakh language diploma rather than Russian. So it's a trend that would really be a defining one. But unfortunately, Kazakh language media is largely is a lack of finances, which is really decreasing this the ability to use this potential to form a certain language that will be based on your local kind of values and how you try to interpret the world. When I worked in the media for a couple of years, the real tendency was that many private companies' marketing and PR budgets were really going into Russian media outlets rather than Kazakh media outlets. This is because of a certain inertia, and some of the staff in PR departments are really Russian speaking first, and most of them are based in large cities, like Astana and Almaty, which is largely multilingual, cities. But I think, for example, when last couple of years, we see that many of the books, for example, from the Western authors has been translated into Kazakh now. It still doesn't create so much revenue compared to Russian book publishers, but we see this general trend, and music and film industry is actually pushing this trend forward as well. But we still need time, and we still need, the shift of this dimension that Kazakh society doesn't generate revenue and doesn't, you don't need to care about your brand or a company, and you work solely with Russian audience. I think this mindset needs to change, and it will be changing in a couple of years, 5 or 10 years, probably. Yeah.
Thanks, Danyar. That's a really interesting point, because we have talked, the point of this webinar was, how does media influence economic decision-making? But you're raising, I think, the really important point that there's an economics to media itself. So if we want certain kinds of media to flourish, it needs to be economically viable. And I know, for example, this is something that Nozima and the foundation she leads are looking at in Uzbekistan. But I want to turn to the sort of core economic questions again, and turn back to Timur, who is hopefully with us, although we can't see him, and to ask him to sort of maybe wrap up the conversation by going back to the economic issues before I turn to Hasan for his closing remarks. But Timur, I'm interested in kind of going back to this event that you mentioned. So there was a meeting between Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev and Russia's Minister of Trade. The meeting was happening on the sidelines of Inoprom, which is a large industrial trade exhibition that was taking place in Tashkent last week. And it was a joint project between the Ministry of Investments of Uzbekistan and the Russian Ministry of Trade, with participation from the governments of Belarus and, I believe, Tajikistan. And one of the things that occurred to me in hearing you describe that meeting was that it's not only Russia that can do propaganda. And what I mean by that is that it might also make sense for governments in Central Asia to appear to be maintaining the same high level of engagement with Russia that they have in recent years. But under the surface, maybe the pledges to increase cooperation are not necessarily going to be implemented because of practical challenges and because of need to maybe diversify, as has come up in the conversation. So I was interested to hear from you whether you think that that is also a possibility. Are we going to see, from the standpoint of Central Asian governments, an effort to make it seem like business is going on as usual, but where in reality there is going to be this effort to kind of maybe freeze or minimize ties given the sanctions and other challenges?
Yeah, I'm here. For those of you who think that I'm not, I would say that I actually think that there is a huge possibility that Central Asian countries would now, while they're talking with their Russian counterparts, they will be promising that everything stays the same. They will not, be interested in making Russia mad because, it's not safe for your territorial integrity, actually, as we all know now. They will be promising Russia what, Russia wants. I mean, Central Asia, for years, especially Uzbekistan, was kind of champion promising a lot of things and do not actually all of the promises from the leadership about human rights, about anything. Of course, I'm not saying that there is no development at all, but it's made to a certain point that does not kind of change the political system and structure completely. So, and here as well, I think Central Asia will continue to do this smile diplomacy, will continue when it comes to talking with Russia, signing these MOUs, continuing business as they used to, especially when it comes to those, agreements that were signed before the war. But when it comes to new opportunities or new cooperation lines, I think they will minimize it to a point when Russia will not have anything to be mad about, or it will not fundamentally disrupt economic stability of Central Asia on itself. But it's now, I think, after more than 2 months of what is going on with Ukraine, it's obvious that it's just, very, very, Russia has become so toxic that it's impossible to create, new cooperation projects or something like that with Russia, because Central Asia really is geographically isolated, and it doesn't want to be isolated, even in diplomatic terms.
Thanks, Timur. I mean, obviously, this is something that, will make sense to track, and I'm sure that in your work, you'll be following this closely in the coming months and year to see how exactly the economic relationship evolves. I mean, there's been a lot of writing about what the economic fallout could be and how governments will respond. We have to remember it's barely, I think, 2 months since all of this sort of started. So, it's when it comes to the economy, it will take time to see how things shake out. But Hassan, I wanted to turn to you for some final comments. Hopefully that was the conversation that you had in mind when you brought together this brilliant panel and suggested the topic, but it would be good to hear from you kind of your reflections before we close out the discussion.
Thank you, Esfandiar, and thank you, everyone. This was brilliant. I learned a lot. I'm an amateur media follower, of course. I do not do this professionally for living, as our esteemed panel does, but I did really learn a lot, especially perspectives from localities, and of course, cutting-edge research by Anton and Hannah, whom I consider leading researchers in the area. This was really brilliant, and thank you very much, Timur, especially, I think at the aftermath of Carnegie Moscow Center coming under such a pressure to exit Russia, him finding time and sharing his knowledge and expertise with us. I really appreciate that. So some of the notes that I took a lot. I hope to follow up maybe with a short piece on Bourse and Bazaar Foundation's website. And now I'm binding here Esfandiar to publish it. So I guess it would be essentially that, first of all, it would be a good message here to send to Central Asian policymakers and decision makers who are definitely watching us and will watch us at some point, to treat media freedom as national security matter, because it's really important to support local media, to support national media. And what I mean by support actually is you should be really careful about what you seek here is not more state funding, more state regulation, but in fact, a very simple, the easiest of all, and the most difficult to do is non-interference. Just don't do anything and let it be. Probably this would be the best way to help local media to flourish. We've seen that in Uzbekistan in the past 6 years, under some of the limited efforts on media freedom, freedom of expression, it's been a real outburst of development. We've also seen at the aftermath of civil protests, which sometimes turn violent in Kazakhstan, how local media helped to build up not only accurate coverage in Kazakhstan, but also brought in some of the experiences of CSTOs, in a way invited participation in Kazakhstan's national security order by bringing in some of the critical points, which later on, I believe, passed away to view Russia's invasion into Ukraine in a more critical view, in a more critical aspect, which was also good. The other thing I noted, as Timur said, is choosing between political interests and national interests sometimes are entangled and sometimes are difficult to disentangle. I think this was a superb point. There are obvious, very rational reasons why Russia remains as a very important trade, economic, investments partner. But I also would really like to hear anchor some of my closing remarks on Daniar's excellent point on cultural benchmarking. This is also a product of limitation of freedom of expression in Central Asia for such a long time, that Russia, which was much freer in essence, became such a cultural mecca in a sense, and people looked up to it. And then it started absorbing in for different ways, because when it comes to Russia, it is, especially in 2022, it is very difficult to say who in cultural media space, amongst all those people who are extremely popular superstars, as mentioned, which of those can actually be independent intermediaries with their own critical voices, who can be truthful when expressing their culture, their products, meanwhile stating they're actually apolitical, which actually makes them so much more political. I also like that the viewpoints by Hannah and Anton that resources matter a lot. So Russia actually tries to overspend local media and simply tries to overcrowd independent alternatives in independent media platforms, which actually it bans at home very often. A very funny anecdote here. So when a Russian-speaking media outlet, which is viewed as more Russian propaganda susceptible, interviewed the UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, the portions of the interview were used to troll UK embassy by the Russian embassy on Facebook in Uzbekistan. And Facebook is, again, all the media products are banned in Russia. But Russian government is not shy of using what it bans for the public abroad. And this means, as with anything else what Russia is doing in Ukraine, here Russian state participation in media is also, in essence, asymmetric tradecraft. So it's very important to understand that rules can bend for those who create them. And it's very important to remain vigilant about that as well. And the other thing is what Mass Media Foundation is doing in Uzbekistan is important, but also probably Mass Media Foundation and all the other organizations, whether government affiliated or not, should do probably more with state media as well, because state media really commands a lot more resources, a lot more space, especially when it comes to TV. There are no independent TV news channels in Uzbekistan which really command the audience. In fact, Kunuz, Daryo, Gazette are amazing because Kun and Daryo each command more than 1 million subscribers on Telegram, which is an amazing audience. But very often than not, internet is limited, infrastructure is limited. We can see today by the evidence of Timur not being able to easily connect from Samarkand, that internet infrastructure is one of the primary targets for governments to invest in, because by investing into internet and media infrastructure, they're actually investing more also into their own national security by making their public more resilient when it comes to susceptibility to foreign media influences. And obviously, people like Nikita Makarenko are real heroes of today when it comes to ethical journalism and how they stand up. And obviously, it would be better to see some of the officials in Uzbekistan also to react to bullying of their own media representatives by foreign media actors, because obviously Uzbek media organizations, different professional unions such as National Mass Media Foundation, which Nozima leads, reacted, in fact, when some of the local journalists were bullied, harassed, prosecuted even by local authorities. But when it came to Robert Frantzev's, not one, but two outings, the foundation was silent. So probably this would be also one of the aspects to look at. And the last but not least, probably is what I started my conclusions with, is to really think about national media, freedom of expression, media freedom as foundational rights, not only in human rights terms, which are incredibly important and really should be a cornerstone in practice, as they're all set actually in all of the 5 republics in Central Asia's constitution, but also really in practice. But also when it comes to political media space, when we understand that in Central Asia, we do not really have anything that we can call a vibrant democracy. Probably country which comes closest to it would be Kyrgyzstan, but also with a lot of conditional footnotes. Important thing for us to understand probably would be that even for such political regimes, authoritarian spaces, media freedom would really equate national security in long term. So thank you so much for this excellent panel. I learned a lot. This was amazing. I hope that we can put together events like this more often. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us and for staying till the end. A recording of this session will be made available hopefully in the next few days. But I want to thank all of the speakers and Hassan for the brilliant idea for this webinar. And hopefully we can continue this conversation in different fora moving forward. But have a good day or a good evening wherever you are. And thank you again for joining. Bye-bye.